Hey guys!
Hey, how's it going?
Welcome back to our channel. We are back to discuss a another topic of interest in our new
Another,
format.
yeah, another discussion on a guest editorial.
Right,
Another guest editorial.
in
Also
the
in the,
archives for sexual behavior.
yeah.
Hmm.
Well, the other one was not in the archives, was it? Might
Um,
have been.
yeah, no, actually it was. Yeah.
It was. Okay.
Yep.
So it's almost like a guest editorial battle that's happening right now. I wouldn't say battle, because I don't. This person actually doesn't. I think it does slightly reference it, but not necessarily a
Yeah,
strong
maybe in
battle.
the same vein, but a broader look at sex research
Right.
um, as a field, right?
Yes.
Not just sexual harassment like we were talking about last week, but actually like the things that are affecting sex research right now.
Mhm.
Right.
Yep. And this one, this guest editorial is by Dr. J. Michael Bailey. It is How to Ruin Sex Research.
Right.
Uh, yeah.
Right.
Which,
Yeah. So I'm actually quite familiar with Professor Bailey. Um, I was when I was in graduate school. I was a little torn between two paraphilias that I wanted to study. One was necrophilia, which I ended up writing my dissertation on, and then the other one was autogynephilia.
mhm.
So now, for those of you who don't know what autogynephilia is, if my memory serves me correctly, autogynephilia was first written about by Kenneth Zucker, and what his research found was that there seemed to be this paraphilia that exhibited itself mostly in natal males, so cis males, uh, and it initially looked like it might just be cross dressing, but there seemed to be um, something deeper. There was a sexual arousal that was associated with these men imagining themselves as women, and they were uh, and attracted to themselves as women. So the idea of themselves as women was sexually arousing, and their sexuality focused on that female representation of themselves that they would manifest through cross dressing. And that seemed to distinguish itself from gender dysphoria. Um,
Mhm.
and the concern was is that people who were presenting as gender dysphoric and who were getting gender reaffirmation surgery were in fact not gender dysphoric, and they were running into a whole host of problems by transitioning.
So they believed that they were. So what you're saying is what this research is suggesting is that they believed that they had this gender dysphoria, but in reality it was, or not in reality, but what the research is saying it wasn't gender dysphoria, it was autogynephilia.
Right.
And whenever they transition, there's some regret there, or there's some kind of cognitive dissonance because really it's more of the sexual attraction to.
Right. It's more of a sexual attraction to the female version of themselves, and um,
Wow.
there were some serious like psychological implications from folks with AG transitioning. So,
Yeah.
and then Michael, he was one of these scholars whose name popped up as I was trying to decide what I wanted to study. Michael Ray Blanchard, Ann Lawrence, who was a graduate of the institution I went to, and J. Michael Bailey. And he wrote a book actually that I read when I was studying called The Man Who Would Be Queen: The Science of Gender Bending and Transsexualism, which was published in 2003. Um, and he reviewed the theory of Ray Blanchard that there are two unrelated forms of transsexualism, one being an extreme type of homosexuality and one an expression of autogynephilia. Now, recently, my understanding is that um, some of the science that's being born out of studying autogynephilia, there's and I'm not quite clear on it, so I'll have to do a little bit more looking into it. But my understanding is that some research are suggesting that gender dysphoria starts with autogynephilia. So it, I don't quite understand it myself, and I haven't looked at the research, so I have to come back to it. But and I'm a little hesitant on anything scientific having a cause and effect that clear.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I have to look into it more, but there, autogynephilia has always had this uproar around it, and especially people who are gender dysphoric, they already have an issue with stigma. You know, we see
Mm-hmm.
that now in the government with the trans ban and these kinds of these attacks on transgender people from the government in the United States. And so, and they're often, you know, words like pervert and sickos and stuff are often associated with trans women, especially. And so, trans folks really took issue with it because for them it was sexualizing their gender identity in a way that was detrimental to their well-being and to their ability to um, have basic human rights, especially in the eyes of our governments and medical communities. So that's a little bit of a background of J. Michael Bailey, but I'm really familiar with his work.
Yeah.
And
So
so he's the one that published this paper,
right.
which was
So he go
in
ahead.
February.
Right. So they popped out with this paper. Again, this is a guess. I feel like I have to say this every time we do this. This is an editorial. It's not research.
But this paper doesn't claim to be.
Right. This paper doesn't claim to be.
Right.
The last paper we did didn't claim to be either outright. It didn't explicitly claim to be research. I think there was some attempts to suggest that this is data.
Right.
So this is not. This is just J. Michael Bailey's. Is it just Michael Bailey or is it?
I've known him as Michael Bailey.
Okay.
But his paper is J. Michael Bailey, but I do believe that he uses Michael.
It's probably Dr. Michael Bailey.
Yeah, it's Dr. Bailey.
Yeah, Dr. Bailey.
All right.
I believe Dr. Bailey is just offering suggestions. That's really what it is. So it's almost like it's an observation, but it's almost a little tongue in cheek. Like I found there's like parts of this I laughed like out loud.
Yeah. I found it to be academically snarky.
Yes.
Right.
That's a good way to put it. It was academically snarky.
Yeah. Ironic.
But I even chortled a couple times, and yeah, I thought there were parts of it that were entertaining,
right,
funny. The main premise, you know, is him just offering suggestions on. He jokingly says in the first page, like the whole point of this is I adopt the hopefully rhetorical assumption that Quad S wants to ruin sex research and offer advice, most of which the statement appears well on its way to enacting about how to do so. And what he's saying is, I mean, going off what you were.
Well, so now you might want to tell those viewers who don't know what Quad S is, what's Quad S?
Right. So let me set up the whole thing. His whole article was there was another article written about, or maybe it wasn't written, but one of his grad students, I won't mention his name, but if you want to read the article, it's in there. One of his grad students was presenting at Quad S. Quad S is the Society for the Scientific Study of Sex. They are just an academic group that gets together. They have conferences every year, and people present their research.
Right.
And they, you know, they're an organization, and I know some people in it, and I feel like it is an important place for people to come together. Yeah.
Yeah, we've hosted a party or two at the museum for them when they've actually had their conference in Las Vegas.
Yeah. I've done a couple poster presentations there in my earlier days. I am no longer a member of Quad S for other reasons that we might again get into later. But But this grad student presented at Quad S on autogynephilia and some of the stuff you were talking about. And the point was the audience would not let him get through his presentation.
Well, actually, he did name someone. I'm actually familiar with her because she went to my graduate school as well.
Okay.
And I've been in class with her, and she when I was in a class with her, she was presenting on a study that she had done on men who visit sex workers.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons why they visit sex workers, and to help destigmatize Johns as being sort of these lecherous perverts, and her research was actually rather compelling and pretty, for what it was studying, quite complete from my perspective. Now, I was just a grad student at the time, so if I looked at it now, maybe I'd have a different opinion, but she was a very serious student. She was a serious scholar. But this was, I think last time I saw her was maybe almost 10 years ago. So.
Right. We don't know the context of which she was speaking up. Right. She was disagreeing with what he was saying. Maybe she had an issue with his methodology or something like that. Right. But the point was she was disruptive. And because, so it was believed she was disruptive because of what he was saying about trans folks in relationship to autogynephilia.
Right.
And rather than Quad S supporting the scholar who was trying to present and finish, they published.
The way that I read it is he was there presenting because he had received the Society's annual Ira and Harriet Rice Theory Award.
Right. He had received this award from them on this paper.
Yeah.
On this research.
Right.
So that's an excellent point. Thank you for adding that. Yeah. He was there by invitation. He was there to present this information, this data to these people from Quad S. And there was disruption by this person, and rather supporting the scholar, it's quoted that the Quad S Executive Committee is aware of past and most recent incidents of language and behavior that has made transgender persons and other attendees feel unwelcome, unsupported, marginalized, and attacked at our annual meeting. We apologize. We want to assure all members and attendees that we will fully support you and stand with you. We are trans allies.
Right.
You can do both. This is my first argument against Quad S. I realize this paper is we'll get into the meat of this paper, but this is one of my issues with Quad S. You can do both. You can support trans and support the research. This researcher who probably spent a shit ton of money getting to Montreal, because that's where it was.
Right. And actually, people on social media, a lot of scholars are saying, you do realize that other than the big name keynote speakers, we all have to pay to go to present our papers.
Yeah. Montreal's not cheap either.
Right.
So yeah, you can do both. You can, because it is both. It is a both and situation.
Yeah.
But anyway, so then Michael Bailey jumps on and writes this paper and is basically addressing all the shortcomings of Quad S, and even in sex research in general. I think he critiques a lot of these popular tropes and consistent rhetoric that happens within sex research. And I think it's great. There are I had some critiques of what he was saying, and I think it just comes from different fields that we're in that create these critiques.
Well, he's in psychology, and I know some of your opinions on psychology.
Yeah. As a sociologist, we have our opinion.
Yeah.
But the first thing he mentions that he drops into, which I think is great, is this idea of truth over advocacy, which I've been saying for a long time. Even in sociology, we have this problem too, because sociology in a lot of places is really leaning towards gender studies. like gender studies departments, which he talks about.
Yeah, he does
Like
talk about that, and I was unaware of the history of where gender studies evolved from. When I was in school, I was I was studying paraphilias and just never really got into specifically necrophilia, so I never really got into gender that heavily. And I know there are whole like departments built around gender studies. So
right, and so you have this, especially in sociology too, you have these leanings over advocacy over scholarship, is what I call it. You call it activist scholars as opposed to scholars who then feed into activism.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
Well, in sexology, it depends on really as a sexologist, because I didn't study any one particular discipline, although I'm leaning more and more towards neuroscience. But sexology leaves a lot of room for what I like to call a foo-foo element. And I know it's probably going to piss people off that I say that, but a lot of these sort of like more spiritual yogi type of approaches towards sex. I think sexology is rife with this kind of sort of like activism kind of stuff. It's in sexology we say, okay, well, you've got the yogis over here and the spiritualists over here, and then you have the researchers over here, right? So we're aware that there are those people that are ecosexuals and stuff like that.
well, I think it also stems from different people not staying in their lane. We'll call it that.
You're gonna get in trouble for that one.
I don't care.
Okay. Go for it.
You have scholarship, right?
Yeah.
Scholars should not be promoting activism. They shouldn't be. The idea is to influence policy, sure, but it's not biased to like lean in a different way. And that's what he's talking about in here, is this idea that advocacy seems to want to be the driver of research. Advocacy can push research, because he talks about that, when he's talking about in his research of bisexual men, the advocacy group came out with their own research and found new stuff.
Fabulous example.
Yes, it should push research along or help research, but it shouldn't get in its way. It shouldn't be necessarily the driving force behind it.
Yeah. So let me just interrupt you for a minute, Josh. So for our viewers, what Professor Bailey or Dr. Bailey wrote about was a study. It was, let's see, it
was on bisexual men.
Bisexual males, or that there were no bisexual arousal patterns, and so the president of the American Institute for Bisexuality came out and approached him and said, "Hey, you know what? I don't agree with that. So I'm going to fund a research project." And we'll see what happens. And turns out that they did actually have a subset of bisexual identified men that had bisexual arousal patterns. So they went into this together and found results that neither one of them were really expecting.
Which is the way it should go.
Exactly.
Right. That's the way it should.
Right.
To be an activist and to demand that science not happen because you're not happy with how the results are, or how it's being conducted. Now, as long as it's being conducted ethically, of course, right. That's getting in the way. But what I mean by staying in your lane is like every field, there's always some overlap, right? There's always overlap in the field, but rarely do people operate in those overlaps. Most of the time, people operate pretty embedded in the theoretical framework of their field.
Yes.
And in that respect, you should speak to the theoretical frame that which you're basing your argument on within that field.
Right.
I hate to say it, where I see that bridging from a lot is public health, particularly public health sexologists.
Okay.
They want to just make this sweeping claims about sexuality and about advocacy and all this stuff, but they don't report a lot of things properly on their own. One thing they don't report are HIV and AIDS statistics.
Mm.
Yes, they want to push the safe sex, I'll say propaganda, from a fear-based framework, but the statistics show that, hate to say it, there are substantially more cases and newer cases of HIV in men who have sex with men than any other group.
Okay.
Unless they're like needle sharers, right? Like the AIDS crisis in the Midwest, that wasn't men having sex with men, that was opioid crisis. That was people using heroin and fentanyl. But outside of drug use, within the realm of sexual behavior, it's men who have sex with men. Now, I'm not stigmatizing them with that data, right? That's just the data that shows that's being presented. But a lot of times in public health, you don't see that. You don't see those reports. Also, there is a class component to STIs and HIV, not contraction, but the spreading of HIV and STIs. Like people who don't have the funds for healthcare and testing are going to have more cases of STIs. That's just the nature of the beast. Like that's what the data shows. And I think it's important to show that data rather than saying everyone's at risk. Because no, not everyone's at risk. They show that research shows that we have your socio-sexual circles. So if you're having sex within those social groups that you're acquainted with, whether they be economic, whether they be racial, whether it be sexual orientation groups, oftentimes if you're staying within those groups, your rates of transmission are low, or at least contraction are low, depending on the group you're in. Now, it's when you venture off into those groups that you increase your likelihood of contraction.
Well, and you make a really interesting point about class. You know, some of the folks that might be watching our videos are aware of PrEP, right? So that's the medication that you can take that is 99% effective at blocking HIV transmission. That to get that prescription, unless you have really good insurance, you're looking at $1,200 a month for that prescription. So absolutely class plays a role in the transmission and treatment of STIs. Yeah.
Right. So if you're talking about public health, you know, you're talking about epidemiology, you're talking about STI statistics, you're talking about health. I don't necessarily think there's a theoretical foundation to be arguing the basis of, say, what Michael Bailey studies, the basis of homosexual orientation. Like those two are theoretically different things. But you see a lot of public health sexologists doing these sweeping gestures about sexuality in general from this, you know, public health framework. And I think it gets muddled. And of course, here we are making sweeping claims about other fields of sexual research, but you get my point.
I would only add to that what you're saying about the data in terms of HIV transmission, and we also want to remember, you know, that, and I'm gonna play devil's advocate here and be on the side of public health for a second, even though I'm not a public health scholar. I think the purpose of public health doing what they're doing is to err on the side of caution, to just have this message of, hey, let's just have safe sex. And there is some research to bear that out. I mean, there was just an article that was published maybe last year or the year before that showed that among monogamous couples, STI rates were, for those that were claiming to be in a monogamous marriage or monogamous relationship, STI rates were actually higher because they are less likely to have conversations about STIs and are less likely to practice safe sex. So going outside of your social circle, there's probably truth to that, and there's also truth to the idea that communication and responsibility and ethical behavior when we're navigating our sexual relationships with other people all kind of commingle, and it gets messy. So I get why public health would want to have a blanket statement.
Right, but my point was that public health only talk about that rather than trying to theorize about the basis of homosexual orientation. Right, that's not in their theoretical wheelhouse.
Right.
That's a lot of psychology. Now, should they work together? Absolutely, and I think that's what he was getting at as far as the president of the AIB. You know, they worked together. I'm sure they came from different fields, perhaps, and they were able to find new data, and I think that's important. But whenever you start kind of overstepping from a theoretical standpoint or trying to make claims about other fields, I think it gets a little tricky. And we in sociology, we're guilty of this too, because in sociology, we look at groups, trying to understand behaviors, patterns in groups, but also we take it down to the individual level, and you have this crossover of social psychology and things like that. So, but we tend to do that as well, and I think it gets tricky. I think it gets a little muddled. So that's what I mean by kind of staying in your theoretical lane.
So he was talking about this weaponization of activism, things like linguistic sensitivity over efficient communication, don't question people's identities and narratives. And he makes some reasonable points in here about, look, we get it. I get it. You know, when someone is trying to find their bearings or trying to be validated, it sucks to have someone say, well, that's not your real identity. It marginalizes them and so forth. And yet, there's this famous T-shirt that says, "Science doesn't care how you feel." And science isn't, the scientific process and the results of science it doesn't intend to hurt your feelings. It just is. The results just are. The problem is when those results are weaponized. Right? So there's like all kinds of weaponization going on. There's weaponization of science going on, which is not intended to be used as, and there's a weaponization of victimhood. It's sort of a counterbalance to that. So it's just a recipe for disaster, you know?
But I think, and this was actually, I wrote these down as my critique of what he's saying in support of the language use and the politics, is that, just as I said, public health should stay in their lane, so should psychology. Psychology has a very long and sordid history about, particularly psychology and medicine, in relationship to sexuality. And I think when it comes to these marginalized groups, queer folks, trans folks, gay, lesbian folks, there's a lot of distrust in science around sexuality for good reason. Like there's 1974 is when homosexuality was finally removed from the DSM. Like it was a mental illness, labeled as a mental illness. So you have people bristle at hard evidence. You have people bristle at science telling them who they are. Now, when we're getting into language, we have to understand that language is how we think, right? The superior hypothesis tells us our language is how we form reality. Right. And I think language in these groups that he's referring to, language is how they create the in-group and out-group. It's how they frame their political, not agenda, but just their political action. Because if you know the proper nomenclature, if you know the most up-to-date hip lingo, you're in the in-group. If you don't, you're obviously in the out-group. and then we're not gonna, you're here to stifle us as opposed to help us. So it's this continued change. You see this in like more pop culture and hip hop culture. Like if you don't know the new hip term, you're obviously not cool.
But
You're not in the in group.
that has
And
the
so,
potential to isolate a lot of people, because how, like, he makes a good point of that. Like, how do you keep up with that? Because it seems to change constantly. And the consequences for not knowing it is not you're just not part of the in group, but you are like severely penalized and accused of things like he said in here, which are, you could be accused of misogyny or transphobia. It's not just, oh, you're just not part of the in group, but you have become like the enemy and
yeah,
the person who is victimizing and abusing these groups.
yeah,
Right.
absolutely. You see it, you see it all the time. If you don't have, you could be in like a political group,
Mm-hmm.
and if you misspoke because you don't have the new
Mm-hmm.
terms, it can be detrimental. As long as you're willing to apologize and adhere and follow along and learn the new language, then you're part of the in group.
Right.
But if you're not, you don't know those language, you're using antiquated language, it's a quick identifier of who's in the in group and who's in the out group. And you're right, it can be marginalizing or limiting to people who aren't in social media or don't have their ear to these things, and they could belong to that group.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a way to kind of hold together this political action. And the reason they need this political action, and I have to support this, that like I said, they've had this sordid past with science and medicine, which has influenced policy, or policy has cherry picked pieces of science and medicine,
Right.
right? And so these marginalized sexual groups have to maintain a political framework. That's why the T is still in LGBT. Theoretically, they have completely separate frameworks.
Yeah.
They're completely different arguments.
Yeah,
They're
trans folks
completely
do not feel
right.
supported by the queer community or the lesbian and gay community at all.
Well, I mean, because they're lumped in for political reasons. Mm-hmm. They're lumped in for political action. The more people you have in the group, the more recognition you can get. Mm-hmm. But you're right, their frames are completely different. Even the queer and trans community technically have different arguments. Mm-hmm. Because the trans...
Yeah, and what I've heard a lot from the trans community, at least here in Vegas, is once the L and G parts of the community got recognition in terms of marriage equality, they were just, bi people have generally considered themselves pretty much invisible, and from both the gay and the straight community. And trans people, they basically said, hey, what I've heard anyway is once the lesbian and gay community got, marriage equality, trans people were just thrown out with the bathwater. It's like, oh, we don't need you anymore because, we have this now. Now,
right,
I'm not a member of the trans community, so I can't verify. I'm just hearing that secondhand from people that are in the trans community, at least in the Las Vegas area.
Right, and you hear this, and he actually referenced this as progressive sex research in relationship to gay rights, right, including gay marriage, same-sex marriage. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, from a critical perspective, same-sex marriage is not progressive. Same-sex marriage is an assimilation agenda.
It's a conservative assimilation.
It's right. Conservative assimilation. Mm-hmm. So that's where I can see like the trans and queer community kind of bristling at this, because especially the queer community, because they're more based in postmodernism, mm-hmm. that wants to just break down and deconstruct all these social categories, right. as opposed to reinforce them through marriage. And that's where the bifurcation through queer and trans comes, because trans mm-hmm. as a foundation is transition. Mm-hmm. That's the root of that, is transitioning from one to the other because you feel you are the other, right? Now,
which the queer community has a real issue with, and you hear this a lot with older generation trans people who still use the identification as transsexual, who are now being, from their perspective, persecuted by the younger queer community for choosing a binary.
or they're using the wrong words.
Right. Like
They're not in the in group because they're using an
in group,
antiquated word.
Buck Angel has been pretty notorious about that. He's very adamant about the fact that he is a transsexual man. That's his identity. He's not going to veer from that, and he has been deplatformed over and over and over again for toxic masculinity and reinforcement of a binary and a lot of these things. So yeah, it's a
Yeah, and you do see, there are some, of course, the Venn diagram of trans and queer overlaps, and you have this middle ground of trans folks who are taking the label as trans because for whatever reason, but they really are queer folk because their gender expression is not, you know, feminine and really like, they're more androgynous, or they have more fluidity, but they're still taking that trans folks with an X framework, as opposed to queer folks. And I think your even people within that community and people who don't know these words, who aren't in this field, use the term trans interchangeably with queer, but don't understand the difference. Even queer folk, or even, like I said, people in that field, or people who identify as that, don't do enough research to understand the true difference. And so they just use the label without actually understanding it. And I think for him, he's talking about this advocacy for those groups, those marginalized groups, but really, we as scientists can't adhere to those, like you said, feelings. Science is hard. Science doesn't care about your feelings. Right. And I agree with him. I think it's important.
Now, there's, and again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So one of the sections in here that he wrote about was discourage discussion of controversial ideas. On principle, I agree with that. No stone unturned in science kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Now, so a lot of the viewers know that I'm half German, half American, and spent a lot of my youth in Germany growing up. And in Germany, we do have certain limitations on speech, as it pertains to, the aftermath of the Holocaust and these kinds of things. And so there are some ideas that just are not discussed because they are discounted on their face, like eugenics, right? So, and in the United States, we have the First Amendment where there should be no limit on speech. So I find myself kind of existing in between those two. Should we discuss controversial ideas? Yes. And when we get into tolerating intolerance, we're walking a very dangerous line, right? So, again, to play devil's advocate, I don't think we should be afraid of controversial ideas, but I think there are some ideas like tolerating intolerance that I don't know are worth discussing other than perhaps from a historical perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I disagree. I think as far as tolerance, first off, what do you mean? Or intolerance. You said tolerance of intolerance.
So it's sort of this paradox, right? That if we tolerate intolerance, then we are allowing intolerance to grow. And so if you have people that are saying, well, I should be able to discuss the idea that, people of color are intellectually inferior.
Mm-hmm.
And here's how I can back this up. It's that kind of an idea that I'm doesn't have merit in my view. Especially because, at least to my knowledge, there's not really any any science that claims that it can prove this has been disproven.
Right.
Okay. So that's what
Right. So
I'm
in the
referring to.
right. So in the discussion that's happening, if this individual is trying to spout this information, then that's where citing the sources that disprove it are important. Like the guy, I forgot his name, but he came out. He was been discredited and like kicked out of university. The guy who was trying to argue that same-sex parents are bad for children.
Right.
You remember that was just a couple years ago?
Mm-hmm.
And now recently there's been a couple studies that show that it's not.
Right.
It's fine. It's just like any other having two-parent household, right?
Mm-hmm.
But because probably his speech, his attempts to create this data, this theory, people have disproved it, which I think is what he's talking about. Like, you know, we can't, like, it's wrong to claim like words of action, right, against people. That's wrong. Violence against people.
Right.
When people start saying that words are violent, that's where it becomes tricky to discern between what's violent and what's not violent. You know, like me upsetting you could see as violent under that argument. And I think it becomes this, and I hate using the slippery slope argument, but yeah, I think it's relative here. Because then we're just talking about what is hate speech and what is not hate speech. And
yeah, and we don't want to go down the road for this.
Yeah, that's not what the point is. But he addresses that. He talks about that it's, if in the way I see it in science, if you don't like the way something is, the data in which you find something, do your own research. Find your own research. Find your own answers. Do they support what's being said? Are they contradictory? Because that's the whole point. That's the whole point he's getting at, is that when we stifle one thing, we're going to stifle both. When we start stifling because we're uncomfortable with the potential results or the results themselves, it's actually interesting that he cites this in the first page. He refers to the punishment of pedophiles in relationship to their harm. And I don't think it was a coincidence that he cited the Rhine study from 1998, the Rhine et al. Study. Huh?
Talk about that.
So the Rhine study was a controversial study that looked at sexual behavior between adults and children. It was a meta study looking at the effects and looking at different aspects of child sexual behavior or adult-child sexual contact. And what it found was not what people wanted. It actually was sanctioned by Congress. It was the only scientific study sanctioned by Congress, because what it found was that the effects of sex between adults and children is not nearly as damaging as we think it is. That's what he's referring to.
Okay.
If it's a close relative, yes. If there's violence, yes. A lot of times the long-term trauma, one of the main contributors to long-term trauma from in a child is the reaction of their environment.
I've heard that before, yeah.
Right. So,
and the same thing with incest too.
Right. And so that's what he's getting at, is that study was stifled. That study has a lot of controversy around it, and people, I don't think, have picked up much after it. What information, what knowledge could be gained from testing what they found again, you know, or building from their arguments or building from what they found. Like, it's important to do that, but we don't, because we've sanctioned this study. And so sanctioning studies prevents further studies. Sanctioning language prevents further exploration.
Well, sanctioning studies, yes, I agree with you. And again, I'm playing devil's advocate. I think that in our era of weaponization, the concern is that there won't be enough time to do a study to discount another study, because the original study that ends up being disproven has already been weaponized socially, right? So again, I'm playing devil's advocate here. as to the issue that could be taken with discouraging discussion of controversial ideas. That the argument might be able to be made, well, we need to do that because the controversial idea that might incite violence or marginalize a group would take too long to disprove before, and it would already have been weaponized.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the devil's advocacy that I'm the side that I'm taking here for a second.
Right. And let me build off that to my other two critiques, or my other critique and my addition to his advice at the end.
Okay.
He doesn't come out and call it qualitative, but his critique of I believe it's on page 2, particularly about people's narratives, and then moral and political sensitivities. He said of scientific presentations and publications rather than the accuracy of their scientific context. What he's talking about here is qualitative research.
Okay.
And so my critique is at both and. I critique his he comes down on qualitative research, but also I want to say that the place that it goes is the problem. Qualitative research in and of itself isn't an issue. Qualitative research becomes an issue when, just like you said, people weaponize it. Right. And people try to generalize from qualitative research. And I do qualitative research. Mm-hmm. I do interviews. My dissertation is interviews.
Yep, me too.
But I'm not trying to make large claims about the greater society based on these interviews, these few interviews that I've done. But what happens is especially unfortunately, in a lot of gender studies research, and in sociology too, where it is this more activist-driven scholarship, I'm collecting 10 interviews.
Therefore,
yeah, I'm collecting 10 interviews from people, and obviously this changes everything we know about gender. How it doesn't.
It doesn't. Right.
Not at all.
Right.
And so I think what qualitative scholars need to remember is that it's not generalizable. Qualitative research is a great introductory. It's exploratory, and it's a great introductory to then dive into the field, to the topic of study. It's a piece. Right. It makes it more robust. It is not the only piece. And then that actually leads me to my third point. He offers advice at the end, right, about how not to ruin sex research. Yeah. The first being resist the trends and inclinations that he's listed above about being overly sensitive and things like that, or like catering to marginalized groups because of activism.
The implications that can come from that.
Right. And the other one is just do the research. My third one is we as scholars need to be more vigilant about how the media sources sensationalize research.
Absolutely. And there was a case recently of a fake sex researcher who claimed to have a sexological medical degree from Harvard. Not a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a problem, is that not only does it seem as though they're looking or getting interviews from folks who at least in this gentleman's case struggle with the truth, but who who might not take a measured approach to this research that's coming out, that might make blanket statements like always and never kind of language, right? Which is not scientific language.
And you see it all the time, and I feel like this is why people bristle at gender studies research and reports. I see it all the time. Intersex, trans, queer identities destroy the binary or destroy everything we know about gender. No, it doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't.
Right.
At all.
It's a small part. It's a small
part. It's a small part. It's a way of examining gender, but it doesn't destroy anything. It doesn't destroy masculinity. It doesn't destroy femininity. It doesn't destroy these social constructs of gender. It's a way to examine them.
Right.
It's a way to examine, say, biological sex from an intersex perspective?
Mm-hmm.
Are these a new way of looking at gender or looking at biological sex, or are they the outliers
Right.
that kind of prove the overlapping or the bimodal spread of biological sex?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's what's important. That's a sensationalized article that people bristle at, or they weaponize. They get behind. See, we're not, we're breaking down these groups. You're not. You're not. You're really not. Um, they kind of
And
instill this
you
panic.
see that in how the media is handling sex research. You have those who are saying, okay, here are the elements of biological sex and so forth, and certain publications are like, look at these right-winger scholars, sex scholars, there's like an automatic label attached to quoting the science around something that might be unpopular on what's considered the left or the right.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, here's what the research says, and we're doing further follow up on XYZ. It's there's camps, there's
Right.
polarization. Mm-hmm.
Right. And you see this a lot around gender, and you do see this a lot in sexuality. I think it's important for the media to talk about whatever subgroup is actually being researched or looked at in the research,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to lumping everyone together, lumping all gay men together, lumping all lesbians together.
Right.
One of my favorites is the suicide rates of trans folks. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I see this on both sides using the same studies, but not really understanding its framework. The conservatives say, well, why are we allowing these people to transition? Their suicide rates are like 40%.
Right.
Well, what about the social aspect of those suicide rates?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it because there's such intolerance in society? Like, it's just a misuse of this data to create agendas, to create frameworks. And then that's what the media does. And unfortunately, I feel like it's impacting science in a way that will be detrimental going into the future. From both sides, from both the left and the right.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see a big exodus of scholars leaving academia
Mm-hmm.
because either their paper can get submitted and published, but it's not really backed up by the university or a department that they're maybe from.
Yep.
They're targeted by the student body and they have to leave because of safety issues. Because whatever the scientific results were didn't follow a certain narrative.
Should have been the research a little bit. Wasn't there, I believe, a couple of years ago, there was a researcher who produced something about trans folks or something about gender, something, and the university didn't back him up. It was a gentleman.
Wasn't that a university up in like Washington State?
Something like that. And the university completely like threw him under the bus.
Yeah.
I forget what it was, but yeah, you see that a lot where universities don't back up the scholarship that's been done. We actually
follow a narrative, right?
Right. We actually had something similar to that. It wasn't in sexuality research, but it was in, I think, gaming. Because at UNLV, because people don't know it's big gaming institute there. I think there was a gaming study done, and they didn't like the results, and so the university threw them under the bus because they get a lot of money from casinos.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Can't have studies on.
That's a whole nother show on money in academia.
Yeah. Unfortunate.
Right.
Yeah, I think the sensationalizing of articles as to be weaponized is definitely problematic in our field, particularly.
And and this is probably going to be an unpopular opinion, but we as scholars, I get it that it's difficult for us to, unless we have some kind of regular income. Being a scholar is all about how many papers you publish and how much attention you get, and anymore. And that's what seems like, and I've heard some other scholars say that, well, in order to even get to, to be considered a full professor, you have to have, 50 articles published and so forth. And I think to bring the human element into being a scholar, it's hard. I get it, because our economics could be affected. But I think we need to check ourselves and each other that we're not jumping on the sort of activism bandwagon as a popularity contest.
Right. So a lot of
We obviously want to be public intellectuals, and we obviously want to get the information out there. And I think it's a good thing to check our motivations, rather than jumping on a narrative bandwagon that just happens
well,
to.
you're seeing some people come down on what's called the impact factor. People citing their friends, citing people in small groups
Mm-hmm.
just to up their impact factor.
Right.
That then gives them a little more like academic
Mm-hmm.
clout and whatnot.
Right.
And there's some research being done that's showing that perhaps these studies aren't as legit, but are being cited because of the desire for an impact factor. Like, I'll cite you if you cite me,
Right.
and then we'll just keep going
Well,
from
I
there.
think doesn't that play into like these predatory journals?
Yeah,
Yeah. Right. So there's that. Yeah.
yeah.
There's that.
So there's a lot. There's a lot that while Dr. Bailey didn't address, there's a lot of stuff that can be pulled out of this and kind of extrapolated to that, that need to be fixed in all academia, but particularly in sex research. And I do think
Yeah.
our academic institutions like QuadS, these larger groups,
Mm-hmm.
they need to be held accountable for supporting science because that's the whole point.
Mm-hmm.
The Society for the Scientific Study of Sex,
Mm-hmm.
not for the everybody's feelings as long as it's okay,
Right.
study of sex.
Right. Right.
I left QuadS a while ago as a sociologist because I just didn't feel supported in my field. It was mostly psych folks, gender studies, and public
Marriage and
health.
family therapy.
Yeah, marriage and family therapy. I went to a study where this girl this scholar had done her research on threesomes and had collected some interviews on people that had engaged in threesomes and then created this great PowerPoint. And at the end, she said she didn't know what to do with the data. It's qualitative data. There's qualitative journals. Like there's such a disconnect between the fields that they don't even know these journals exist, particularly in sociology. We're not very well represented in a lot of these, like QuadS and ASEC and what is it, ISAR or what have you. There aren't a lot. We have our own. We've kind of sectioned ourselves off, and we have our own little sexuality groups. But just as I said, people should stay in their lane. People should also reach across the aisle more.
Well, and I would add to that as and Dr. Bailey makes a good point in here about let's see, where does he have that? That that in sex research we're already suspect.
Yeah.
What's wrong with you that you're studying sex? And so from my perspective, I think it behooves us to be even more accountable. Because we're not taken seriously, because we're chuckled about, and I think it would serve us well to consider how we approach our research and the ethics of our research, perhaps to a greater extent than, say, someone in physics or in biology. Right?
Absolutely.
So overall, I thought I actually sent this paper to a physics friend of mine, who's very, very big on solid evidence and reasoning, logical thinking, and even he said, that he was impressed with some of Professor Bailey's argument. I keep tossing between doctor and professor, but between Dr. Bailey's reasoning, he thought it was really solid, and I did too. I read it, and aside from the chuckles, I was like, there's a lot of really good points in here, and I think it can be expanded on. And I think it's on us to consider seriously what he's breaking down in this guest editorial.
Right. Yeah, he does. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people to read, and a lot of people aren't going to like this because he does go after gender studies a lot.
Right.
He critiques them as a field, which he's right. They are not a very hard. I don't want to use the word hard science. We'll say empirically based field.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of their field is theory. It's theorizing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's Judith Butler, who is a literary scholar. She's not a sexuality scholar. She's not a social scientist. She's a literary scholar.
Okay.
And then Foucault, and Foucault was a French philosopher.
Yeah.
You know, you see that a lot. His analysis of postmodernism, or his analysis with postmodernism,
Mm-hmm.
like it's not the foundations of that field are not based in how we base a lot of our science. And maybe that's something that we should examine as critics
Mm-hmm.
of that field,
Mm-hmm.
is maybe it's a different way of approaching it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, that maybe gender studies is offering a different type of analysis that maybe could be cultivated a little better, but have some relevance. But I do think, again, reaching across the fields to maybe solidify more empirical frameworks in gender studies, but then also using some of gender studies kind of unique ideas, unique ways of approaching data within, say, psychology or public health,
Right.
criminal justice. Even they have sexuality subfields. We do that a lot in sociology. Is we take on qualitative and quantitative frameworks and even feminist um, um, methodologies to come at different data. And I think it's important to do all of that.
Well, and I agree with you. And as a sexologist, that's something that we're encouraged to do, is to look at sex through the lens of each one of these disciplines, and that none elevates itself above the other. Um, and because they all play a role,
Right.
from neuroscience to gender studies, they all have a role to play, and collectively they help to create a complete picture. Maybe not a complete picture, but a more complete picture of sexuality than just looking at it through one discipline or another discipline. So I agree with you on that. There needs to be a lot of, hey, what's your research that can work with this research and this research and this research, and we have a broader picture.
Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I agree completely.
Yeah, awesome. We need to. I agree with him. He said at the end here, and it was really good to hear someone say it, because we all kind of talk about it amongst ourselves, but he actually put it. However, I have never been as worried about the future of sex research specifically and social science generally as I have been in recent years. Now is a crucial time, and sex research is a crucial venue, and that really resonated with me. As someone who's been deplatformed for using the wrong word during a lecture that was unrelated to the usage of the word. This weaponization is, of activism and of how we feel about something I think is doing us all a disservice. I don't want to take away from validating one another, and yet when it starts to be weaponized, we all lose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, thank you, Dr. Bailey, for putting that in there.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for adding this to the grand scheme of social or sex research, or at least the arguments, at least something we all can think about as we go forward into our sex research, into coming up with new projects, using this as a guide tool as to not ruin this Fabergé egg of sex research that we all love to hold on to.
Yeah, and someone who's increasingly become sort of an online friend of mine is Dr. David Ley, and we sometimes joke amongst ourselves about having the sexuality heretics conferences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Dr. Bailey would be a member.
Yeah.
So So I don't know if we've decided on a topic for our next vlog. Have we?
I don't think so. We'll get there.
Okay. Oh, actually, no. We did discuss. What did we discuss? Something about sports.
Oh, trans athletes in sports.
Trans athletes in sports. Yeah, Josh actually made that suggestion. So we're going to work on that and other topics for some of our next shows. As usual, leave your comments and questions in the areas below. We're trying to release stuff on YouTube, and also our Patreon channel is still up and active. And
yeah, you can watch us bake some great things.
Yeah, we bake some great things, and when Josh is back in the States, hopefully we'll get to do some more of that. We've changed our pricing, our support structure a little bit because we're not doing the actual show with the baking and so forth. We've changed our support to, like, there's a $1 option for supporting us, and there's a $5 option to support us. And that's just to help us, keep our equipment going and doing this vlogging, and then eventually getting back to baking some really yummy stuff, and for helping us, like, travel to one another's locations once Josh is back in the States.
Yeah. And please subscribe to this channel as well. We're going to throw up more discussions here or there.
Right. We're going to do a lot of uploading to YouTube, but you can help support us as well by going to our Patreon channel as well.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.